The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Henderson's training grounds as Sarah Martinez adjusted her oversized uniform for the third time. At barely 5 feet tall and weighing 98 pounds soaking wet, she looked more like a lost teenager than a United States Marine. The uniform hung loosely on her small frame, and her combat boots seemed comically large as she made her way toward the administrative building. Sarah had arrived at the base just 2 days ago, fresh out of basic training, where she had struggled through every physical challenge. Her drill instructors had been merciless, constantly reminding her that she was the smallest recruit in her class. Despite graduating, she carried the weight of their doubt and the whispered comments from her fellow Marines about whether someone her size belonged in the Corps. The base was buzzing with unusual activity this morning. Helicopters circled overhead, and military vehicles moved with purpose across the compound. Sarah noticed groups of Marines huddled together, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Something important was happening, but as the newest and most junior member of the base, nobody bothered to fill her in on the details. As she walked past a group of seasoned Marines, she overheard fragments of their conversation. "The general's coming today," one said. "Big inspection. Everything needs to be perfect." Another Marine shook his head. "I heard it's not just an inspection. Something about a new commanding officer taking over the base." Sarah's stomach twisted with anxiety. A general inspection on only her third day? She was still learning where everything was located, still trying to prove she belonged here despite her physical limitations. The last thing she needed was to be singled out during a high-profile visit. She quickened her pace toward the communications center where she had been assigned to work. Her role was simple but important: monitoring radio communications and ensuring messages were properly relayed throughout the base. It wasn't the combat position she had dreamed of, but her superiors had made it clear that her size made her unsuitable for frontline duties. The communications center was a small, windowless room filled with radio equipment, computers, and monitoring devices. Sarah had spent most of yesterday learning the various systems and frequencies. Her supervisor, Sergeant Williams, had been patient but firm about the importance of accuracy and attention to detail. "Martinez, you're early," Sergeant Williams said as she entered. He was a tall, imposing man with 20 years of military experience. Despite his intimidating appearance, he had been kind to Sarah, perhaps recognizing her determination to succeed despite the challenges she faced. "Yes, Sergeant. I wanted to make sure everything was ready for the inspection today," Sarah replied, settling into her chair at the main communications console. Sergeant Williams nodded approvingly. "Good attitude. Today's going to be intense. We've got VIPs coming in, and Command wants everything running smoothly. Your job is to monitor all frequencies and immediately report anything unusual or important." As the morning progressed, radio chatter increased significantly. Sarah listened carefully to the various communications channels, logging important messages and coordinating responses between different units on the base. She was beginning to feel more confident in her role when everything suddenly changed. At exactly 0930 hours, Sarah's console lit up with an urgent message. The frequency was one she hadn't encountered before, a high-priority military channel that was typically used only for emergency communications. She put on her headphones and listened carefully to the coded transmission. The message was brief but alarming. "Blackbird 1 to Base Command. Hostile vehicles approaching from the northeast. Multiple armed trucks. Estimated 30 to 40 personnel. ETA 15 minutes to perimeter." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the alert button. This was exactly the type of communication Sergeant Williams had told her to report immediately. But when she looked around the communications center, she realized she was alone. Sergeant Williams had stepped out just minutes earlier to coordinate with other departments for the inspection. She tried calling his radio but got no response. The standard protocol was to alert the base commander immediately, but Sarah didn't have direct access to command frequencies. Her training told her to find someone with authority, but the urgency of the situation made her hesitate. 15 minutes wasn't much time. Making a quick decision, Sarah grabbed the internal communication microphone and broadcast a general alert across the base. All units, this is communications. We have incoming hostile vehicles from the northeast. Estimated arrival in 15 minutes. This is not a drill." The response was immediate chaos. Her radio crackled with confused voices, demanding clarification and asking for her authorization to broadcast such an alert. Sarah realized she had made a serious mistake. As a new private, she didn't have the authority to issue base-wide alerts, especially ones involving potential combat situations. Within minutes, Sergeant Williams burst back into the communications center, his face red with anger and confusion. "Martinez, what the hell did you just broadcast? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Before Sarah could explain, the communications center door flew open and 3 Marines rushed in. The lead Marine was a tall, muscular man with the aggressive demeanor of someone used to getting immediate answers. His name tag read Johnson, and his rank indicated he was a staff sergeant. "Who authorized that alert?" Johnson demanded, looking directly at Sergeant Williams. "We've got the entire base scrambling, vehicles moving, and personnel taking defensive positions. Command is furious and wants to know who issued an unauthorized emergency broadcast." Sergeant Williams pointed at Sarah. It was Private Martinez. She's new and apparently doesn't understand protocol. Johnson turned his attention to Sarah, his expression a mixture of disbelief and contempt. You're the one who sent the entire base into emergency mode?" He looked her up and down, taking in her small stature and obvious nervousness. "What exactly did you hear, Private?" Sarah tried to explain about the Blackbird transmission, but her voice shook as she spoke. Johnson listened with growing impatience, occasionally shaking his head in disgust. "So let me get this straight," Johnson said when she finished. "You received what you think was an emergency transmission, and instead of following proper protocol, you decided to alert the entire base? Do you have any idea how many resources you just wasted? How many people are now scrambling because of your incompetence?" Other Marines had gathered in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. Sarah could hear their whispered comments and barely suppressed laughter. She was quickly becoming the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. "Furthermore," Johnson continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive, "today is one of the most important days this base has seen in months. We have high-ranking officials arriving for inspection, and you've potentially ruined everything with your amateur mistake." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she fought to maintain her composure. She knew crying would only make things worse, and confirm everyone's suspicions that she didn't belong in the Marines. "I was just trying to follow protocol, Staff Sergeant," she said quietly. "The transmission seemed urgent, and I couldn't locate my supervisor." Johnson laughed harshly. "Protocol? You call broadcasting an unauthorized alert following protocol? Private, you're going to be lucky if you're not court-martialed for this stunt." The situation was spiraling out of control. More Marines had gathered, and Sarah could hear someone calling for military police. She realized that her military career, which had barely begun, might be over before lunch. But then something unexpected happened. Sarah's radio crackled with a new transmission, this time on a frequency she recognized as belonging to base security. The voice was urgent and professional. "All units, confirmed hostile vehicles approaching northeast perimeter. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. All personnel to defensive positions immediately." The room fell silent. Johnson's confident expression faltered as he reached for his own radio to confirm what they had all just heard. Within seconds, additional transmissions filled the airwaves, all confirming the same thing. Sergeant Williams, who had been preparing to discipline Sarah further, suddenly looked uncertain. "Martinez, what exactly did that original transmission say?" Sarah repeated the Blackbird message word for word, her memory sharp despite the stress of the situation. As she spoke, Johnson's expression changed from contempt to concern. "Blackbird 1 is a reconnaissance unit," Johnson said slowly. "They don't make false reports." He grabbed his radio and tried to raise base command for clarification, but the frequency was busy with rapid-fire communications coordinating the base's response to the incoming threat. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone present. The Marine they had been ridiculing for her unauthorized alert had potentially saved valuable time by giving the base advance warning of a real threat. Instead of being 15 minutes behind in their response, they now had time to properly prepare. But Johnson was not ready to admit his mistake. His pride and authority had been challenged in front of junior Marines, and he was looking for someone to blame for the embarrassing turn of events. Even if the threat is real, he said, his voice still aggressive, you still violated protocol. You're still in serious trouble, Private. Before Sarah could respond, the communication center door opened again, and this time a military police officer entered. Sarah's heart sank, assuming she was about to be arrested. Staff Sergeant Johnson, the MP said, Command needs you and all available personnel to report for defensive positions immediately. We have confirmed hostiles approaching, and this is now a code red situation. Johnson hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to continue punishing Sarah and the urgent military situation developing outside. Military training and duty won out, and he reluctantly headed for the door. This isn't over, Martinez, he said as he left. After we deal with this situation, you and I are going to have a serious conversation about your future in the Marines. As the other Marines dispersed to their assigned positions, Sarah found herself alone with Sergeant Williams. He looked at her with a mixture of respect and concern. You did the right thing, Martinez, he said quietly. Don't let Johnson's ego make you think otherwise. You potentially saved lives today by giving us advance warning. Sarah nodded, but she knew the real consequences of her actions were yet to come. She had made enemies today, and in the rigid hierarchy of the military, that could be a career-ending problem regardless of whether her actions had been justified. As alarm sirens began wailing across the base, and the sound of vehicles moving into defensive positions filled the air, Sarah returned to her communications console. Whatever was coming next, she would face it head-on, just as she had faced every other challenge in her young military career. The base was about to be tested in ways none of them had anticipated, and Sarah Martinez, the smallest and newest Marine on the compound, had just positioned herself at the center of events that would change everything. The base's alarm system continued its urgent wailing as Sarah remained at her communication station, monitoring multiple frequencies while chaos unfolded around Fort Henderson. Through her headphones, she could hear the coordinated response of various units moving into defensive positions, vehicle engines roaring to life, and the sharp, professional exchanges between unit commanders. Despite the vindication of her earlier alert, Sarah felt isolated and uncertain about her role in the unfolding crisis. Sergeant Williams had left to coordinate with other departments, leaving her alone in the communications center with instructions to maintain radio watch and report any significant developments. Through the small window of the communications room, Sarah could see Marines running across the compound, some carrying weapons, others heading toward armored vehicles. The organized chaos of military emergency response was both frightening and impressive to witness. This was her first real exposure to the Marines in actual crisis mode, and she found herself both terrified and oddly proud to be part of the organization. Her radio crackled with a new transmission on the command frequency. All units, hostiles have stopped approximately 2 miles from northeast perimeter. Appears to be a scouting force. Maintain defensive positions and await further orders. Sarah dutifully logged the message and tried to make sense of what was happening. Why would an attacking force stop short of their target? Were they waiting for reinforcements, or was this some kind of reconnaissance mission? Her limited military experience didn't provide answers, but her instincts told her this was far from over. 20 minutes later, another transmission caught her attention. This one came from a different reconnaissance unit, Falcon 2 to Base Command. Additional vehicles spotted approaching from southwest perimeter. Different group appears to be official military convoy. Sarah's heart rate increased as she realized the complexity of the situation. 2 separate groups approaching the base from different directions could mean anything from a coordinated attack to a coincidental arrival of the expected inspection team. In either case, the base command would need to make critical decisions about how to respond. She was debating whether to broadcast this new information when the communication center door opened, and a Marine she didn't recognize entered. He was older than most of the Marines she had encountered, with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone with significant experience. His uniform was impeccable, and his insignia indicated he was a lieutenant colonel. "Private Martinez?" he asked, his tone respectful but serious. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, jumping to attention despite being seated at her console. "At ease, Private. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Davis from Base Intelligence. I understand you were the Marine who issued the initial alert about incoming hostiles?" Sarah nodded, unsure whether she was about to be commended or court-martialed. "Yes, sir. I received a transmission from Blackbird 1 reporting hostile vehicles approaching from the northeast. Lieutenant Colonel Davis pulled up a chair next to her console. Tell me exactly what you heard, Private. Every detail you can remember. Sarah recounted the transmission word for word, including the specific time, frequency, and estimated arrival time of the hostile vehicles. Davis listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification about technical details. Private, what you intercepted was a highly classified reconnaissance report, Davis explained. Blackbird 1 operates on frequencies that most communications personnel aren't cleared to monitor. The fact that you picked up their transmission and recognized its importance shows excellent judgment. Sarah felt a wave of relief, but Davis wasn't finished. However, the situation is more complicated than a simple hostile approach. We believe what you detected was part of a larger training exercise that has gone off script. Some of the participants may not have been properly informed about changes to the exercise parameters. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. A training exercise? Had she caused the entire base to mobilize for what was essentially a military game? The embarrassment was almost overwhelming. Davis must have seen her expression because he quickly continued. Don't misunderstand, Private. Your response was absolutely correct given the information you had. The problem isn't with your actions. It's with a communication breakdown in exercise planning that left base personnel uninformed about what was supposed to be happening today. Before Sarah could respond, her radio erupted with urgent transmissions from multiple units. The chatter was confused and overlapping, but she could make out references to friendly fire and ceasefire and Aubert exercise. Lieutenant Colonel Davis grabbed the microphone from her console. All units. All units. This is Lieutenant Colonel Davis, Base Intelligence. Cease all defensive actions immediately. We have a communication breakdown in today's scheduled exercise. Stand down and await further orders. The radio fell silent for a moment before exploding with questions from various unit commanders demanding clarification. Davis spent the next 10 minutes coordinating with different units, explaining the situation and ensuring that all Marines understood they were dealing with a training exercise gone wrong rather than an actual threat. As the immediate crisis subsided, Sarah found herself processing what had happened. She had been right to issue the alert based on the information she had, but she had also been the catalyst for a base-wide emergency response to what was supposed to be a routine training exercise. The implications for her career were still unclear. Private Martinez, Davis said after finishing his radio coordination, you're going to be a central figure in the investigation of what went wrong today. There will be questions about how classified transmissions ended up on frequencies you were monitoring, why exercise parameters weren't properly communicated to base personnel, and how we can prevent this kind of confusion in the future. Sarah nodded, understanding that her involvement in the day's events was far from over. But her immediate concern was more practical. Sir, what about Staff Sergeant Johnson? He was pretty angry about my broadcasting the alert. Davis's expression hardened slightly. Staff Sergeant Johnson will be answering some questions of his own about his response to a potential crisis situation. A Marine who reports what they believe to be critical intelligence should be supported, not ridiculed. The communications center door opened again, and this time it was Sergeant Williams returning from his coordination duties. He looked relieved to see Lieutenant Colonel Davis and quickly brought them up to date on the base's current status. All units are standing down, but we've got some confusion about the original exercise schedule, Williams reported. Apparently, there were last-minute changes that weren't properly disseminated to all personnel. Davis nodded grimly. That's what I suspected. We've got a serious communication failure that could have had much worse consequences if this had been a real emergency. As they spoke, Sarah continued monitoring the radio frequencies, and she noticed something that made her stomach drop. On one of the command frequencies, she heard a transmission that chilled her. Command, this is gate security. We have VIP vehicles approaching main entrance. Appears to be the inspection team arriving early. The pieces suddenly fell into place in Sarah's mind. The exercise vehicles from the southwest that Falcon 2 had reported weren't part of the confused training exercise. They were the actual inspection team arriving for the scheduled base review. In all the chaos of the morning, everyone had forgotten about the high-ranking officials who were supposed to visit the base. Sir, Sarah interrupted urgently. I think we have another problem. She quickly explained about the transmission from Falcon 2 and her realization about the VIP convoy. Davis's face went pale as he understood the implications. "Dear God," he muttered. "We've got a general and his staff approaching a base that's been on high alert, with Marines in defensive positions and vehicles that might have weapons trained on the perimeter." Davis immediately grabbed the radio and began coordinating an emergency stand-down of all defensive positions and a proper welcome protocol for the arriving inspection team. But the damage had already been done. The visiting officials would arrive to find a base that had clearly been in crisis mode, with explanations that would be difficult to provide without revealing the extent of the morning's confusion. Sarah watched as Davis worked frantically to minimize the embarrassment and potential career damage that could result from the day's events. She realized that her simple decision to broadcast an alert had set in motion a chain of events that now involved multiple levels of military hierarchy and could have lasting consequences for many people's careers. But there was something else nagging at her consciousness. During all the radio traffic and coordination, she had heard references to details that didn't quite add up. Some of the transmissions had mentioned specific unit designations and personnel that didn't match what she knew about the base's standard organization. "Sir," she said tentatively to Davis, "some of the radio traffic today has mentioned units and personnel I'm not familiar with. Is it possible there are elements of this exercise that even you weren't briefed on?" Davis paused in his radio coordination and looked at her sharply. "What do you mean, Private?" Sarah pulled out her logbook where she had been recording transmissions throughout the morning. "Here, sir. References to Shadow Company and Operation Nightfall, and personnel with designations I've never heard before. And some of the frequencies being used aren't in any of the standard communication protocols I was trained on." Davis studied her notes with growing concern. "Private, these references suggest there may be classified operations involved in today's events that go beyond a simple training exercise." The implications were staggering. Sarah had stumbled into something far more complex than anyone had realized. What had started as a confused training exercise might actually involve multiple layers of military operations, some of which were apparently classified beyond the level of most base personnel. As if to confirm her suspicions, her radio suddenly crackled with a transmission on yet another frequency she had never encountered. "Omega Base to all units. Exercise parameters have been modified. All personnel are to maintain current positions until further notice. Any deviation from current assignments requires direct authorization from Omega Command." Davis stared at the radio in confusion. "Omega Base? Private? That designation isn't in any of our operational protocols. There is no Omega Base in our command structure." Sarah felt a cold realization washing over her. The day's events weren't just a confused training exercise or a communication breakdown. Something much more significant was happening, and she had somehow become the focal point for discovering it. The small communications room suddenly felt like the center of a much larger and more dangerous situation than anyone had anticipated. And Sarah Martinez, the Marine everyone had dismissed as too small and inexperienced to matter, was sitting at the heart of it all. The mysterious Omega Base transmission had changed everything in the communications center. Lieutenant Colonel Davis was now speaking rapidly into his secure radio, trying to contact higher command levels to understand what was happening on his base. Sarah continued monitoring the frequencies, documenting every transmission in her logbook with growing unease. 20 minutes after the Omega transmission, the communications center door burst open. This time, it wasn't a single Marine, but a full team of military personnel Sarah didn't recognize. They wore standard military uniforms, but their insignia were different from anything she had seen before. A distinctive eagle and shield design that wasn't part of regular Marine Corps hierarchy. The lead figure was a woman in her early 40s with short blonde hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Her uniform was immaculate, and she moved with the confidence of someone who expected immediate obedience. Behind her were 4 other personnel, including 2 who were clearly security specialists based on their equipment and positioning. "Lieutenant Colonel Davis," the woman said, her voice carrying authority that seemed to fill the small room. "I'm Colonel Patricia Stone, Special Operations Command. We need to discuss the events of this morning." Davis stood immediately, clearly recognizing the authority represented by Stone's presence. "Ma'am, we've been trying to understand exactly what's happening here. We have conflicting information about training exercises, unscheduled transmissions, and operational parameters that don't match our base protocols. Colonel Stone's eyes moved to Sarah, who was still seated at her communications console. And you must be Private Martinez, the Marine who initiated the alert sequence this morning. Sarah stood at attention, uncertain about what was expected of her. Yes, ma'am. At ease, Private. Your actions this morning were more significant than you realize. Stone pulled up a chair and sat directly across from Sarah. Tell me exactly what you observed and heard, starting from the beginning. For the third time that day, Sarah recounted the events of the morning, but this time she included all the details she had been documenting, the various transmissions, the unusual unit designations, the frequencies that weren't in standard protocols. Stone listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes. When Sarah finished, Stone exchanged a meaningful look with one of her personnel. Private Martinez, what you intercepted this morning were communications related to a classified multi-agency operation that has been in development for several months. Your base was selected as a testing ground for new communication protocols and coordination procedures between different military branches. Davis leaned forward. Ma'am, with respect, I'm the intelligence officer for this base. I should have been briefed on any classified operations involving our facilities. Stone's expression remained neutral but firm. Lieutenant Colonel, the classification level of this operation is beyond your current clearance. Base command was informed, but the information was compartmentalized on a need-to-know basis. Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Relief that she wasn't in trouble for her actions, but apprehension about being involved in something classified beyond her understanding. Ma'am, am I in trouble for monitoring those frequencies? On the contrary, Private. Your ability to monitor those frequencies and recognize the importance of the transmissions demonstrates exactly the kind of intuitive communication skills this operation was designed to test. One of Stone's personnel, a young man with technical specialist insignia, stepped forward. Colonel, we should proceed with the evaluation phase while we have optimal conditions. Stone nodded. Agreed. She turned back to Sarah. Private Martinez, we'd like you to continue your communication monitoring duties, but with expanded access to frequencies and protocols that are normally restricted to much higher clearance levels. The implications hit Sarah like a wave. She was being offered access to classified communication systems as part of some kind of evaluation or test. It was an opportunity that could change her entire military career, but it also carried risks she couldn't fully understand. Ma'am, I'm honored, but I'm just a private with basic communications training. I'm not sure I'm qualified for whatever you're asking. Colonel Stone smiled for the first time since entering the room. Private qualification isn't always about rank or formal training. Sometimes it's about natural ability and the right instincts. Your actions this morning demonstrated both. Before Sarah could respond, her regular communications console began receiving urgent transmissions. The voice was familiar. It was Staff Sergeant Johnson, and he sounded agitated. Communications Center, this is Johnson. I need immediate clarification on current operational status. I've got Marines asking questions I can't answer, and we have VIP vehicles at the main gate that no one seems to know how to handle. Sarah looked to Colonel Stone for guidance. Stone nodded for her to respond. Staff Sergeant Johnson, this is communications. Stand by for instructions from command. Stone took the microphone. Staff Sergeant Johnson, this is Colonel Stone, Special Operations Command. Report to the Communications Center immediately for briefing. There was a long pause before Johnson's voice came back, clearly confused and somewhat intimidated. Yes, ma'am. On my way. Davis looked uncomfortable. Colonel, Johnson was quite critical of Private Martinez's actions this morning. He may not be receptive to learning that her decisions were actually correct. That's exactly why I want to see him, Stone replied. Part of today's evaluation involves assessing how different levels of personnel respond to unconventional situations and information. 10 minutes later, Staff Sergeant Johnson arrived at the communications center. Sarah could see the confusion and concern on his face as he took in the presence of Colonel Stone and her team. He was clearly trying to understand how a simple disciplinary situation involving a new private had escalated to involve special operations personnel. Staff Sergeant Johnson, Stone began. I understand you had concerns about Private Martinez's actions this morning. Johnson straightened to attention. Yes, ma'am. Private Martinez issued an unauthorized base-wide alert without following proper protocol. It caused unnecessary panic and resource expenditure. Tell me, Staff Sergeant, what would have been the proper protocol in Private Martinez's situation? Johnson began explaining the standard procedures for reporting potentially urgent communications, but as he spoke, Sarah could see him beginning to realize the flaws in his argument. The protocols he was describing would have taken significantly longer and might have resulted in critical delays if there had been a real emergency. Stone listened patiently, then asked, "And if Private Martinez had followed those protocols exactly, how much additional time would have been required before an alert could be issued?" "Approximately 15 to 20 minutes, ma'am, depending on the availability of supervisory personnel." Which would have meant that in a real emergency situation, any defensive response would have been delayed by that same amount of time? Johnson hesitated, clearly beginning to understand the trap he was walking into. "Yes, ma'am, but protocols exist for a reason." "Indeed they do, Staff Sergeant, but they also need to be balanced against the reality of rapidly developing situations." Stone paused, letting her words sink in. "Tell me, what was your assessment of the tactical situation when you arrived in the communications center this morning?" "Ma'am, I believed we were dealing with an unauthorized alert issued by an inexperienced Marine who had panicked under pressure." "And did you take any steps to verify whether the alert might have been accurate before beginning disciplinary action?" Johnson's face began to show the realization of his mistake. "No, ma'am. I assumed the alert was false based on the source." "Based on the source? Explain that reasoning." Sarah watched as Johnson struggled to explain his assumptions without explicitly stating that he had dismissed her alert because of her size, gender, and inexperience. His discomfort was obvious, and she almost felt sorry for him. "Staff Sergeant," Stone continued, "one of the most dangerous tendencies in military operations is the assumption that information can be dismissed based on the rank or experience level of the person reporting it." The lesson was clear, and Johnson understood he was being criticized not just for his treatment of Sarah, but for a fundamental failure in leadership judgment. Stone turned to Sarah. "Private Martinez, I want you to demonstrate for Staff Sergeant Johnson the communication monitoring capabilities you've been using today." Sarah returned to her console and began cycling through the various frequencies, explaining what she was hearing and how she was interpreting the different types of transmissions. As she worked, Stone provided commentary about the importance of intuitive communication skills and the ability to recognize patterns in complex information streams. Johnson watched the demonstration with growing understanding of what he had witnessed that morning. Sarah wasn't just a small Marine who had panicked. She was someone with natural communication abilities that were apparently valuable enough to attract the attention of special operations personnel. When the demonstration was complete, Stone addressed both Sarah and Johnson. "The events of this morning have provided valuable insights into communication protocols, leadership decision-making, and the importance of recognizing ability regardless of conventional expectations." She turned specifically to Johnson. "Staff Sergeant, you'll be receiving additional training on crisis communication and leadership evaluation. Your response to this morning's situation demonstrated areas where improvement is needed." Johnson nodded, clearly understanding that his career had been impacted by his handling of the morning's events. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." Stone then addressed Sarah. "Private Martinez, you'll be receiving a temporary assignment to work with my team on this communication evaluation project. Consider it an opportunity to develop your natural abilities in a more advanced operational context." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the rapid changes in her situation. In one morning, she had gone from being a criticized new Marine to being selected for a special assignment that she still didn't fully understand. "Ma'am, what exactly will this assignment involve?" Colonel Stone smiled again. "Private, you're going to learn that sometimes the most important military operations happen not on battlefields, but in communication centers, where the right person with the right instincts can make the difference between success and failure." As the implications of her new assignment began to sink in, Sarah realized that her military career was about to take a direction she had never imagined possible. 3 weeks had passed since that chaotic morning in the communications center, and Sarah's world had transformed completely. The temporary assignment with Colonel Stone's Special Operations Team had evolved into something far more significant than anyone had initially anticipated. Sarah found herself working in a secure facility adjacent to the main base equipped with communication technology she had never imagined existed. The work was challenging and intellectually stimulating in ways her basic training had never prepared her for. Instead of monitoring standard military frequencies, she was now analyzing complex communication patterns between multiple agencies, identifying potential security threats, and coordinating information flow for operations that spanned different branches of the military. Her small stature, which had once been a source of ridicule and doubt, had become irrelevant in an environment where mental agility and communication intuition were the primary requirements. Colonel Stone's team valued her natural abilities and had provided intensive training to develop her skills further. But the most surprising development had come just that morning, when Colonel Stone had requested a private meeting with Sarah to discuss what she described as a significant opportunity. Now, sitting in Stone's office, Sarah listened with growing amazement as the colonel explained the true nature of the communication evaluation project and Sarah's role in its success. "Private Martinez," Stone began, "what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels, and it will fundamentally change your understanding of your position in the military hierarchy." Sarah nodded, accustomed now to receiving classified briefings, but still awed by the trust being placed in her. The communication evaluation project was never really about testing new protocols or coordination procedures. It was about identifying individuals with exceptional natural communication and analytical abilities who could be developed for highly specialized roles. Stone paused, studying Sarah's reaction before continuing. "You demonstrated exactly the kind of intuitive intelligence and decision-making ability we were looking for. Your actions that morning weren't just correct. They were exemplary examples of how effective military communication should work." Sarah felt a flush of pride, but she was still confused about where the conversation was heading. "Ma'am, I appreciate the confidence you've shown in me, but I'm still not sure I understand the full significance of what you're saying." Colonel Stone smiled and reached for a folder on her desk. "Private Martinez, how familiar are you with the concept of deep-cover military operations?" "Basic familiarity, ma'am. Operations where military personnel assume civilian identities or work within other organizations to gather intelligence or accomplish specific objectives." "Exactly. Now, what I'm about to propose will sound unconventional, but I want you to consider it carefully." Stone opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "We have an opportunity to place you in a position where your communication and analytical abilities could serve a critical national security function. However, it would require you to assume a role that would appear to be far above your current rank and experience level." Sarah stared at the documents, trying to process what Stone was suggesting. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand. The operation requires someone who can function effectively in a high-level military command environment while maintaining the ability to monitor and analyze communications without attracting attention to their true purpose." Stone leaned forward. "Your natural abilities, combined with your current lack of visibility in traditional military hierarchies, make you an ideal candidate." The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to come together in Sarah's mind, but the implications were so extraordinary that she could hardly believe what she was hearing. Stone continued, "The position would require you to take on the role of a base general, with all the authority and responsibility that entails. You would be supported by a carefully selected team who would be aware of your true mission, while the majority of base personnel would see you as their legitimate commanding officer." Sarah's mouth dropped open. "Ma'am, you're talking about making me a general? I'm barely 21 years old, and 3 weeks ago I was being yelled at for issuing an unauthorized alert." Age and traditional career progression aren't always the most important factors in special operations, Private. What matters is ability, judgment, and the capacity to fulfill the mission requirements. Stone pulled out additional documents, including what appeared to be a complete military record showing a fictional career progression that would justify Sarah's appointment to general rank. This would not be a permanent assignment to general rank in the traditional sense. It would be a deep-cover role designed to accomplish specific intelligence and security objectives. Sarah studied the documents with growing amazement. The fictional career record was incredibly detailed, showing rapid promotion through various positions that emphasized her communication and intelligence capabilities. It was convincing enough to withstand casual scrutiny while providing justification for her unexpected appointment. "What exactly would be the mission, ma'am?" We have intelligence suggesting that there are security vulnerabilities in the command structures of several military bases. These vulnerabilities could be exploited by hostile forces or compromised personnel. We need someone in a command position who can identify and address these vulnerabilities without revealing the true nature of the investigation. The scope of the operation was staggering. Sarah would be placed in command of a military base with thousands of personnel responsible for their safety and operational effectiveness, while simultaneously conducting a covert investigation that could have national security implications. Ma'am, even with the fictional background, won't people question how someone my age achieved general rank so quickly? Stone nodded. That's a valid concern, and it's part of why this assignment would be both challenging and effective. Your youth and apparent inexperience would actually be advantages in some respect. People tend to underestimate young leaders, which could give you opportunities to observe and analyze situations without arousing suspicion. Sarah thought about Staff Sergeant Johnson's reaction to her that first morning, and she began to understand how her perceived weaknesses could be turned into operational strengths. There's another factor, Stone continued. The base where you would be assigned has recently experienced several security incidents and communication failures. The previous commanding officer was reassigned under circumstances that suggest possible compromise. A young, energetic new general with a strong background in communications and intelligence would be a logical choice to address these problems. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She would be assigned to fix problems at a base not entirely unlike the confusion and communication failures she had witnessed during her first days as a Marine. Who would know about my real identity and mission? A small team of carefully vetted personnel who would serve as your primary advisors and support staff. To everyone else, you would simply be General Martinez, a rising star in the Marines, who has been given an important command responsibility. Stone paused, allowing Sarah time to process the magnitude of what was being offered. Private, I need to be honest with you about the risks involved. If your cover were compromised, the consequences could be severe both for you personally and for the broader operation. You would be essentially alone in a position of enormous responsibility, required to make decisions that could affect thousands of people while maintaining a secret that you couldn't share with anyone outside your support team. Sarah felt both terrified and exhilarated by the prospect. 3 weeks ago, she had been worried about surviving basic communications duties. Now she was being offered the opportunity to command a military base in service of a critical national security mission. Ma'am, can I ask why you're offering this assignment to me specifically? There must be other personnel with more experience and training who could handle this kind of responsibility. Colonel Stone smiled. Private, do you remember what you did that first morning when you heard what you believed was an urgent threat communication? I issued an alert to warn the base. Exactly. You didn't worry about whether you had the authority. You didn't hesitate because of your rank or experience level. You saw a situation that required immediate action, and you took it. Stone leaned back in her chair. That kind of instinctive leadership and willingness to take responsibility is exactly what this mission requires. Sarah realized that her entire military experience, from the ridicule she had endured because of her size to the communication skills she had developed, had been preparation for this moment. Everything had led to an opportunity that seemed impossible but felt exactly right. If I accept this assignment, when would it begin? Within 48 hours, you would be transported to your new base and introduced as the new commanding general. Your support team would already be in place, and briefing materials would provide you with everything you need to know about the base's operations and personnel. And the decision felt enormous, but as Sarah considered everything that had happened over the past few weeks, she realized that her choice had actually been made the moment she decided to issue that first alert. She had committed herself to taking responsibility and making difficult decisions in service of something larger than herself. Ma'am, I accept the assignment. Colonel Stone extended her hand. Welcome to the most challenging and important work of your career, General Martinez. As they shook hands, Sarah felt the weight of her new responsibility settling on her shoulders. In 48 hours, she would walk onto a new base as its commanding general, responsible for the safety and effectiveness of thousands of Marines while conducting a covert mission that could affect national security. It was terrifying and exhilarating, and exactly what she had joined the Marines to do, even if she had never imagined it would happen quite like this. The young woman who had been dismissed as too small and inexperienced to matter was about to become one of the most important people in the United States Marine Corps. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but think about Staff Sergeant Johnson's reaction when he eventually learned the truth about the weak Marine he had tried to intimidate in the communications center. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Sarah Martinez was about to prove that truth in the most dramatic way possible.